and exchange snow for rain here in San Diego.
I will trade that anytime.
Thank you for your comments, and again, they're very helpful to me because they help me. They'll help me as I go forward in terms of clarifying exactly what I mean by terms of art, and also in terms of what I would be looking for as I further investigate antebellum usage of privileges and immunities, and whether or not it developed a particular meaning of the type that you're talking about. Let me say just a few things and see if these are responsive to your points. First of all, as far as the different sides talking past one another during the Missouri debates, I think we're quite right. To a certain degree, you had a presentation of the pro-slavery side that the pro-freedom side kind of found an easy out to respond to, saying, well, these are not state-conferred rights. Slavery is a state-conferred right, and privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States are federally granted rights. And you're absolutely right that one of the responses by the pro-slavery side is, well, we're talking about privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, and what we mean by that is popular sovereignty, again, as that word was used at this period of time, meaning the right of each individual state to decide for itself whether or not to allow slavery and not have it controlled actually by Congress. So you're right that there's a certain speaking past each other, but it was a little bit more complicated. The pro-slavery side actually deployed a number of arguments. Of course, both sides did. But the pro-slavery side deployed a number of arguments, one having to do with privileges and immunities under Article 4, the other having to do with the Republican Guarantee Clause, out of which they derived this popular sovereignty right of each state with its own Republican form of government being allowed to decide for itself whether or not to allow slavery. Well, the Article 4 argument was fairly effectively destroyed by the pro-freedom side, saying that only protects a certain amount of equal rights within a state. It doesn't give you the right to carry rights from one state into the other. And also, there is no national right to slavery. So at that point, the pro-slavery side moved away from Article 4 and actually began to accept the presumptions of the pro-freedom side that privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States had to be derived from the federal Constitution, and so they then began to explore what provisions in the federal Constitution actually conferred upon them this right of popular sovereignty and the right for each state to decide, the equal footing kind of argument for the admitted states. So I agree with you that there is a certain degree of talking past one another, and I might even agree with you that maybe the pro-slavery side had a certain degree of reasonability in terms of its popular sovereignty argument. But what I took away from the debates is by the end of them, both sides seemed to be accepting the basic proposition that the rights that were conferred upon American citizens as American citizens had to be rights derived from the Constitution itself and not rights derived as a matter of state law. Now, of course, all of these arguments, moving to your second point, all of these arguments were derived as a matter of political argumentation. So you're going to have all of the rhetorical tools, all the effort to use whatever seems to give you a little bit of leverage on the other side. It's kind of hard to derive any reasonable interpretation of law from this type of heated political back and forth. But I would say that it's out of this kind of political discussion that ideas begin to be embraced by one side of the political discussion or the other, and these ideas can ultimately become crystallized or might actually inform one of those sides if they become victorious enough to actually entrench their ideas into the Constitution of the United States. So as much as this might have been in its early formative period during the Missouri debates, and as much as these ideas were being developed for political reason, because they were being developed by the side that would most influence the members of the 39th Congress, I think their ideas, including their politically generated ideas, deserve to be taken seriously to at least the extent of creating the possibility that those political ideas became legal ideas which informed the members of the 39th Congress, particularly John Bingham, who, of course, Daniel Webster was his hero. He probably didn't have a greater hero in terms of those who came before him. Then finally, the kind of evidence that we would look for in defining a term of art. And again, this is a very helpful part of your comments that I want to spend some time thinking about. I think you can help. This is going to help me greatly in terms of clarifying what I'm trying to say. But for the moment, just to take your point and accept that as the kind of thing that you would look for to find a developed term of art. The idea that in Congress they would teach each other. They would tell each other, no, actually, when we use that phrase, we mean something more precise, something more specific. Well, I'll just end with this. It turns out that during the 39th Congress and the later Congresses up until the 42nd Congress, John Bingham did exactly that. When members of the 39th Congress or up until the 42nd Congress began to talk about privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States as if they were related to Article 4, on more than one occasion, John Bingham stood up and interrupted them and said, no, we did not put that language into the 14th Amendment. We put different words into the 14th Amendment which had a different meaning. And then he tied that meaning, of course, as we probably know, he tied that meaning into the substantive provisions actually enumerated in the Bill of Rights. So I think it's possible to develop, even under that kind of definition of term of art, that might be a place that I can further develop this as I go, but I just wanted to point out that some of that evidence actually does exist. All right. Thank you.
A substantive fundamental right guarantee of state rights, nor is it an equality provision. How do we get congressional power to pass civil rights legislation out of Section 1?
Right. One of the something that John, of course, has written about, and again, one of the reasons why I'm so pleased that John is commenting on my paper is due to the fact that I've long been an admirer of his work on privileges or immunities. And one of the things that John has pointed out in his work is that when you're talking about privileges or immunities, you have to start with the idea that it's meant to, at the very least, authorize the Civil Rights Act, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1866. And here I think the record is actually quite complicated. I think to a certain degree some members of the 39th Congress believed that the Privileges or Immunities Clause authorized the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but you can also find other members in Congress, John Bingham, in fact, who believed that the Equal Protection Clause authorized the Civil Rights Act of 1866. One of his problems with the initial Civil Rights Act was that it only protected citizens. And he believed that equal protection and the due process protections were natural rights of all persons, and of course he put that into his draft of Section 1. And so later on, and he talks about this in his speeches, that he actually looked to the Equal Protection Clause. So I think it's a bit complicated to find the precise provision. And I don't think you can say that all the members of the 39th Congress looked to the same provision in terms of authorizing the Civil Rights Act. I think you can find it. You can find it both places.
Randy Barnett.
As always, I find Kurt's work very, very interesting. As always, I know that I can't really critique it until I read the sources that he, as always, presents for the first time to his great credit. So this is a preliminary reaction to this paper. I have two preliminary reactions. First is that the thesis is, if you read the paper with this in mind, his thesis is that privileges or immunities, the phrase privileges or immunities refers to conferred rights. And the word conferred appears dozens and dozens of times. I haven't done an electronic word search to see how often it appears in this article, but it's all over the place, conferred rights. And today, conferred. Well, how often does conferred rights appear in the sources that Kurt, his copious sources that Kurt has identified for us? Again, I haven't done an electronic word search, but where I find it appearing once in a footnote 76. And it's very interesting where it does appear, which is this Ohio proposal. For the Ohio Constitution refers to special privileges or immunities which prohibits legislature may have a right to alter, by which special privileges or immunities are conferred upon a portion of the people. So here's a reference to a special privilege or immunity conferred. So the question is the conferral of rights what the privilege or immunities of citizens of the United States refers to, are these conferred rights? And I think the answer is that the evidence doesn't support that. Well, what would be an alternative to conferred rights? Well, there are at least a couple words I would use. One is recognized, rights, rights that are recognized by state law or state constitutions, rights that are recognized by the federal law. These recognition of rights could be a recognition of pre-existing right. A conferred right is a right that the source of which is the conferral. These are special rights, but a recognition of rights could be a recognition of a previous right, or secured rights, rights that are secured by state legislation, state constitutions, or state laws, or by the federal. But a secured or recognized right could therefore include a pre-existing right, and they wouldn't just be special rights that are conferred by others. That's the first problem I have, that the evidence that's presented in this paper does not support the characterization of privileges or immunities as secured. The second point, which is related, is that assuming that it did support that, assuming that all privileges or immunities are conferred rights, we know, beyond peradventure, that not all privileges or immunities are, that not all conferred rights are protected as privileges or immunities. We know, for example, the right to dig clams is a conferred right conferred on state citizens that is not protected by the Privileges and Immunities Clause. So if the entire set of privileges or immunities as a term referred to conferred rights, it would only be a subset of conferred rights that would be protected legally under the Article 4 or Section 1. And at that point, you have to look for some criteria by which you distinguish conferred rights that are protected from conferred rights that are not. And what would be such a criteria? Well, something maybe like fundamental rights. And in fact, that's how we all know that's how Article 4 is currently dealt with, which is you have to distinguish between the fundamental rights, which are protected, and the non-fundamental rights, which are not. And the idea of conference doesn't help us with that. What might help us with it? Well, something like the principles of fundamentality you find in Corfield versus Coryell, which mention granting or recognized by, but also mention fundamental rights that people have against all free governments, not just particular states. So those are my two problems with the thesis as currently formulated.
Thank you, Randy. And I think, and we've talked about this before, and I think that's an important point. It's one for me to grapple with. The idea that of course I take a positivist use of language in terms of using the word conferred, where at the same time that we know, even though the idea of natural rights was in some degree of flux during this period of time, there certainly were those who still very much believed in the idea of natural rights that were not conferred, but might be recognized or not recognized by different governments, but which actually existed. So I think your point is quite right, and I think that your work has nicely shown that, and your upcoming work that we're going to talk about, I guess here fairly quickly, does as well. So I agree with that. Maybe in terms of where I'm going, it does involve a degree of conferring, and I did primarily find it in certain areas where they recognized, where they used the terms privileges and immunities conferred upon corporations, right? I mean, the legislature would create them. So it's quite often was very much an act of positive law. But of course, the idea that I'm trying to embrace also includes the idea of source of rights. Right. The idea that the source of one's privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, when you look at the particular sides in the Missouri debates, the source of rights came from the federal Constitution. Now, you could say, yes, as recognized in the federal Constitution, and Bingham and others, or the proponents might say, correct, maybe the Constitution is recognizing things which people always have believed are natural rights. But at the same time, if you're going to use that term, if you're going to use that phrase, privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, you are looking to a particular source of recognition of whatever the particular right might be, as opposed to Article 4, you're looking to states as the source of whatever these fundamental rights might be. And I also, a couple of things. I think the right to gather clams in Corfield was not a conferred right. That was the natural property right of the people of New Jersey. Right, they owned the clams. It was part of the soil. But your general point, I think, is quite right. I think that you had to distinguish one set of conferred state rights from another set of conferred state rights. That was one of the difficulties, one of the jurisprudential difficulties of Article 4 case law. And of course, one of the arguments was whether or not conferred political rights counted as fundamental rights, which were protected under Article 4, and you had different directions in the case law as far as suffrage was concerned, the political right of suffrage. So that was a difficulty, and that was something that they were struggling with, and it included arguments of natural rights. I think you're absolutely right. What were the natural rights which states have always provided their own citizens, which as a matter of comedy ought to be extended to others? So I agree that those are, that was a distinction which had to be drawn. It probably did include discussions of natural rights. I think it did include that. Let me just say that. But at the same time, there was still a distinction in the rhetoric, as far as I can tell in the evidence, that you were looking for a discussion. The sources emerged out of state law and its recognition of positive and natural rights, as opposed to the source of the federal Constitution and its recognition of positive, conventional, and natural rights. But still, I think I do have to be careful with the word conferred in the piece, and from our conversations, you've convinced me that I need to take another look at that. I think you're right.
So, I just wanted to address the term of art issue that's raised in Kurt's paper and also by John Harrison's comments. And it seems to me it's helpful here to distinguish 4 categories or 4 different ways in which a phrase can have meaning. So the first way is sometimes referred to as natural meaning, but this is the idea that you have a phrase that the meaning of which can be determined by looking at the conventional semantic meaning of the individual words, the privileges, or, and then the principle of compositionality, that is the way in which those words combine, right? And just to state the obvious, it's very hard to get a definite meaning out of the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States from the conventional semantic meanings of privileges, immunities, and the principle of compositionality. A second idea is idiomatic meaning, right? That is, that the meaning of a phrase can vary systematically from the meaning of the individual words as they would be combined by the principle of compositionality, and that phrase can enter into the natural language as a whole unit of meaning, right? So that would be the case if it turned out that you could ask a farmer in western Massachusetts and a baker in St. Louis, what does this mean, the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States? And they'd say, oh, well, we all know what that means. That seems unlikely. So then a third idea is the idea of a term of art, right? And the notion here is that there is a division of, Hillary Putnam is the one who pointed out that this idea stems from the underlying notion of a division of linguistic labor, the idea of linguistic subcommunities. Right? So there could be a linguistic subcommunity, lawyers, let's say, or some subset even of lawyers who use the phrase consistently with each other, right? And the phrase would lack idiomatic meaning, you couldn't figure out what it meant just using the principle of compositionality. You'd have to ask a lawyer what it means. That's different from a fourth idea, which is stipulated meaning, right? We can stipulate that a given phrase has a meaning, and as long as everyone's aware of the stipulation, then we're good to go, right? If you run into real problems, if you have a stipulated meaning and your audience is unaware of what the stipulation is, then there could be a failure of communication. So John says that terms of art must be taught, right? But that's actually incorrect as a matter of what we know about language acquisition, either in or outside of linguistic subcommunities. You can learn a phrase of art the way we normally learn language, right? And that you don't even have to be aware that you're learning it. No one has to explain it to you. Humans have this natural capacity to acquire new units of meaning from patterns of usage, and this would be the case in the case of terms of art as well. There is a kind of meaning that has to be taught, that has to be explicit knowledge. That's stipulated meaning, not terms of art, right? So it's a fundamental misunderstanding to think that knowledge of terms of art must be explicit and taught. So that goes then to the kind of evidence that we would need, which is, I think, the payoff of John's comment. And I think that what you are looking for is consistent use. If you want to argue that it's a term of art, you're looking for consistent patterns of usage in an identifiable linguistic subcommunity. Right? And I don't know whether that's there or not there, but that would be the kind of evidence you're looking for.
Right. And this is, all going to Randy's point in terms of being careful about using the word conferred, and John's point in terms of being careful about using term of art. Obviously, it's important to the success of my paper, right? Because ultimately, you can tell where this paper is going to go. You can tell that part 2 is going to look at the evidence as to whether or not this distinction survived into the debates of the 39th Congress. And so I would be looking for evidence and developing the kinds of evidence that there was some type of consistency, right, into maybe the idiomatic meaning, some type of consistency in the use of this particular term, and that it was used in a way that distinguished itself from, for example, a different term of art, that meaning Article 4's privileges and immunities of citizens within the several states. Part 2 is going to be exceedingly difficult, right? And I can highlight where this is going to go right now. You found different people using the phrase in different ways. There was a substantial incentive on the part of one group of Republicans, in particular the so-called radical Republicans, who wanted to push the idea of privileges and immunities as far as they could, to the extent of granting the federal government power to regulate civil rights in the states, and not just specific rights that were listed in the Bill of Rights, but all civil rights would become a matter of federal control in order to overcome the substantial denial of rights, whether it's private violence or acts of omission by the government or acts of commission by the state governments. So a push in the direction of a very broad reading of privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, and it was perfect for that group to look to Corfield versus Coryell, because you looked at the language that Justice Washington used in Corfield. Don't look at the jurisprudence. Right? The jurisprudence was very much limited to just equal treatment when it comes to state recognized or state conferred rights. But the language saying with the idea of natural rights, the natural rights and the fundamental rights that should be protected always and everywhere, and so they had an incentive to use the language of Article 4 as if it represented substantive national rights that should be subject to federal enforcement. It was the moderates and the conservatives who then stepped in at that point and said that's not the meaning of Article 4, privileges and immunities. That is limited to certain equality when it comes to state-conferred rights. The privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States is a limited set of rights that is limited to those rights actually recognized in the Constitution. So Bingham was fighting this attempt by radical Republicans to take privileges and immunities and use the Article 4 Corfield meaning and take it as far as it could go in terms of federal power. He was resisting that, saying we do need to recognize more rights. We do need to recognize freedom of speech and freedom of religion and the type of stuff that Michael Kent Curtis has developed. But he refused to go as far as the radical Republicans wanted to go because he still hung on to the idea of dual citizenship and the basic federalist structure of the Constitution, where certain areas of law would be reserved to state control. So what I'm going to be facing in Part 2, in trying to create some type of idea that privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States was a term of art sufficient to make it part of the original understanding of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, I'm going to have to grapple with a substantial body of evidence of other members in the 39th Congress who were trying to use the words and take the words in a very different direction. And I think it's its multiplicity of use when it comes to those particular words that has led to such a diverse body of scholarship when it comes to the 14th Amendment.
Yes, a few points. First, relates to what you just said. It seems to me that there would be an odd relationship between term of art and original public meaning, originalism. Because if something is a term of art, by definition, there is no original public meaning of it. It's instead a technical term that specialists use, that ordinary folks who ratify the Constitution would have no understanding of. So I want to know what is going to be the relationship between term of art that you are researching and the original public meaning. Now, the second point is a question about how broad your rehabilitation of Miller's opinion in Slaughterhouse is. Because it could be just the narrow claim that Miller is onto something, as you put it, in distinguishing privileges and immunities of citizens of the several states from privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And you say Bingham emphasized that distinction. But you could also be saying Miller was right about what the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States are. And now, I think it's clear just from your evidence that Miller and Bingham were in disagreement on that. You have in your PowerPoint presentation one of Bingham's statements that clearly indicate that privileges or immunities incorporate the first 8 amendments of the Constitution. And I don't think that's at all what Miller is saying in Slaughterhouse.
Right.
And I think most of the criticism of Slaughterhouse, the reason people put it on their top 10 lists of cases of rule relates to the second point, the argument about what the privileges or immunities are. It doesn't relate to your first point. So I want to know how broadly you're rehabilitating.
And again, your first question regarding term of art and the degree to which using that terminology can work or track the ideas of original public meaning, originalism, again, I think is a very good point. And it may be that, again, as I take another look at John's comments, it may be that the term of art, or a specifically rigorous definition of term of art, is not what I'm looking for, and not what I think originalism actually requires. So I need to take another look at that in order to simply clarify what exactly it is that I'm after. So that's helpful. As far as Justice Miller is concerned, I would turn to Brian here. There has been some wonderful work done that actually calls into question whether or not Miller was actually closing the door on incorporation of the Bill of Rights. And if you look at Miller's opinion, he includes First Amendment rights, the First Amendment right to petition, right? As part. Oh, Michael's shaking his head. The idea, as I read Miller's opinion, he leaves a door open to First Amendment rights as federally protected privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Now, that could be wrong. That could be wrong. But I think that there are some scholars who are questioning whether or not we've too quickly read the Slaughterhouse cases about whether or not he actually was closing the door. If he did, and let's just stipulate that, okay, if in fact the correct reading of Miller's opinion in Slaughterhouse closed the door to incorporation, then I would argue my reading of the evidence, and a lot of this that's going to be developed in Part 2, my reading of the evidence would suggest that that's incorrect, that in fact incorporation was very much a part of both Bingham's views and I think also a reasonable interpretation of privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States in 1868. So I would simply say that he was wrong in that aspect of his opinion, but correct in that aspect of his opinion which distinguished state-conferred rights, as I would put it, under Article 4 versus federally derived rights under Section 1. So again, and this would be part of what I'm going to develop, would be further development and further analysis of Slaughterhouse and what he exactly did or did not leave the door open towards.
My question was similar enough to Randy's that I was just going to pass, but then in your answer, so I'm going to react to something in your answer which I think didn't quite, I think it's not going to get you to where you think you want to go. I don't think that as I understood the answer, you sort of backed off conferral. Maybe conferral isn't the right word, conferred rights isn't the right word, but you emphasized the source, that the source is state law, not federal law, federal constitutional law. But prior to the Civil War, I think there's a powerful argument that the source for fundamental rights, for many of the rights in the Bill of Rights, was the same source, and that was principles of general jurisprudence. That the Takings Clause merely declared a principle of general constitutional law, that you had to have a public purpose and you had to pay fair compensation. And you find state courts relying on that, even in situations in which the state constitution didn't have a Takings Clause. And you even find state courts citing the Fifth Amendment, which technically does not apply against the states, as authority for the takings clause. So I'm not sure how an emphasis on source gets you to where I think you want to go, because the source is the same if you take a declaratory understanding of the Bill of Rights.
Well, I don't want to. First of all, I should be careful not to concede too much, particularly in conversations with Randy. Okay, so I need to be careful there. As my reading of the evidence would suggest that you would find discussions of privileges and immunities that very much adopted the natural rights view. Non-conferral, but only recognition. The rights pre-existed, governments. You would also find quite positivist renderings at the same time. I mean, I think both were in play prior to the Civil War. That being said, when you look at the state level, my work completely agrees with you that that state court justices were not limiting themselves to just their own state sources of law, but you had, as common law lawyers and people trained in Blackstone, they looked over a variety of sources for inspiration about what the law was and ought to be within their particular states, and they quite often looked to the Federal Bill of Rights, even recognizing that it didn't apply legally, that it didn't have the force of law, but nevertheless they saw them as important recognitions of the rights which ought to be recognized on a state level, even if they couldn't be enforced in federal court. And I agree with that, and I've written about that in terms of the free exercise and the Establishment Clause to the Constitution. That being said, when it comes to the goal of the project, of course, is to try and to figure out the original public understanding of the 14th Amendment. And despite the fact that many of the participants in that debate, many of the participants in the ratification discussions might have had this idea of natural law, and whatever's recognized at a state level or a federal level had to conform to certain ideas of justice, certain natural ideas of justice. That being said, there also was very much in play the idea that whatever our conclusions about natural law, we must maintain a distinction between matters national and matters local. So our conversations of natural law at a federal level only go so far, and our conversations of natural law on a state level go so far. They kept the jurisdictions separate. And that's one of the things that John Bingham was adamant about throughout the debates, not just in 1871 or post-adoption of the 14th Amendment. But this is one of the reasons why he opposed the Civil Rights Act. He didn't support the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And he didn't, even afterwards when it came to overriding Johnson's veto, he didn't vote. He was concerned that it went too far in terms of trying to regulate civil rights, even though those civil rights were including rights which many people believed, as a matter of natural rights, ought to be protected. He believed that that was a discussion that had to take place on a state level and not regulated at a federal level. So somehow I have to tell a story that balances all of this. And I think one of the things that I'm bringing to the table that I haven't seen in other scholarship is in addition to the discussions of freedom and rights which ought to belong to free blacks and the role of the federal government in enforcing rights in the South, there was a continued adherence to the principles of federalism and divided government that informed not just the Democrats and not even just the most conservative members of the Republican Party in the 39th Congress, but so existed in such high numbers among the moderates that they couldn't pass any legislation, much less an amendment to the Constitution, without taking into account and preserving this principle of divided government. So I'm kind of overlaying that idea on top of this very rich discussion of natural rights, which I agree did exist at both a state level and a national level at the time of Reconstruction.
I agree with Jim Fleming that the big place most of us have diverged from Miller is not the national rights idea versus states' rights. It is that these national rights that the newly freed slaves got were the right to be protected on the high seas, and once they arrived in Paris, and their crucial right to visit the sub-treasuries, and all that sort of thing. And the First Amendment right, referred to right of petition, is quickly limited only the right to petition the federal government. So if you're petitioning on a state matter, then of course you can massacre these blacks in Louisiana, and it's not a problem because that's not something protected by. But also, I think on a second point, I think you want to be more careful about the way you present Bingham's views. And I'm not suggesting that they are contrary to your view, but it's more nuanced than that. Bingham, to start with, in the speech on Oregon, for instance, says the Oregon proposed constitution is unconstitutional and would be even if they become a state because it violates the privileges or immunities of Article 4. Then he has the ellipses theory, and he says these are not the privileges and immunities of state citizenship. They're words that have been left out, but they're implied. They're the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. So Bingham is reading Article 4 just the way, and then later, in 1871, Bingham seems to say something different. And how do we understand this? I think one possible understanding is Bingham actually read Supreme Court cases. He knew about Barron versus Baltimore. A lot of other people back then didn't know about that. In, what is it, 1868 or 1869, the Supreme Court definitively limits the privileges or immunities clause to equality under state law.
Paul v. Virginia, 1869.
Yeah. So that's one explanation. Another explanation is Bingham's old reading of Article 4, with the ellipses put in, is now in the 14th Amendment. And so he's no longer under any pressure, and it's a lost battle anyway to fight about this other thing. But I agree with you that he was probably focusing on national rights. But I'd be careful on the enforcement point, because Bingham votes for the enforcement acts that reach private individuals who conspire to deprive people of their Bill of Rights, liberties, and similar liberties. One final point on the Civil Rights Act. In the debate in the 39th Congress, you have this colloquy between Bingham and James Wilson. And James Wilson says, well, of course we can pass the Civil Rights Act. We have the Fifth Amendment, the Due Process Clause. And Bingham says, yes, but I agree, that would do it. But and remember, he reads sort of equal protection in the Due Process Clause. But you've got to have a constitutional amendment to be able to enforce it. And there's somebody else there, I think, in the 39th Congress who also relies on the Due Process Clause. So the idea that the Privileges or Immunities Clause was uniquely necessary so you could get the Civil Rights Act, even if you assume that's going on, is belied by a lot of the debates.
Michael's right, particularly that. Let me just take that last point. I think there's very interesting work to be done on the distinction or maybe overlapping of the due process and equal protection clause. Early in the 39th Congress, right, you have many people talking about the equal right to due process in the denial of one's liberty and property. So there was a conflation of the two terms. So I think you're quite right in terms of where exactly you would locate the power. It might be in the Equal Protection Clause. It might also be in the Due Process Clause. Let me address John Bingham, because I think that's a very important point. And I think I use him in this first paper as a provocateur, right? I use him to suggest, oh, look, my goodness, John Bingham is siding with Justice Miller, rendering me subject to some type of libel suit by the Bingham family or something along those lines. And that's unfair to a certain degree, unfair perhaps to a certain degree, because John Bingham had a very rich, and I agree with Michael, a very nuanced vision of equal protection, which I think is why he supported the Ku Klux Klan Act later on. There had to be equal protection, and the states had not been providing equal protection, and so therefore we get to step in. But he had a very nuanced understanding of equal protection, due process, and Section 1. And there are statements that Bingham made early on, both in terms of the Oregon debates prior to the 14th Amendment, and statements that he makes much later on in 1871. And this is why it's these different statements and these seemingly conflicting statements that convinced me to make John Bingham the focus of Part 2. And what I'm going to develop in that particular paper is that there is no illusion John Bingham, in fact, is making conflicting statements in his description of privileges and immunities. His discussion, early in the debates, both in terms of the Oregon debates, and then when he's talking about his first draft of the 14th Amendment, which used the language of Article 4. Bingham insisted that Article 4 had to be read as including an ellipsis, an unstated set of words which talked about the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States in the several states. And so he had this. It's not totally unique. You can find this kind of reading in other places, but it's fairly unique to Bingham in terms of the 39th Congress. And it signaled that what Bingham was after were the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. He was using the language of Article 4, and one of the things I'm going to develop in the paper is he was using the language of Article 4 because he was trying to generate enough votes to get this thing passed, and he was trying to convince the waverers that he was doing nothing other than enforcing provisions which were already in the Constitution. So in his first speech, defending his first draft of the 14th Amendment, he talks about how I am doing nothing other. And this provision, in the majority of its terms, refers to nothing other than provisions which are actually already in the Constitution, and he labels them Article 4, privileges and immunities, and Fifth Amendment. These were the two provisions that he specifically labeled in his first draft of the 14th Amendment. The problem was, Bingham at no time when he was using the language of Article 4, at no time did he talk about Corfield. He never talked about Corfield when he was discussing his original plan. He was using the language of substantive rights, but he never brought up Justice Washington, and he certainly never brought up this list of civil rights in the states which now would be federally enforced. Instead, he was pushing towards an idea of substantive rights, but he found himself facing a group of members of Congress who insisted on reading his language as if it just was enforcing Article 4, and that it was doing nothing other than allowing federal enforcement whenever the states failed to provide equal protection of state-conferred rights. Bingham ultimately withdraws that draft, creates a new draft which jettisons the language of Article 4, and now just uses the language of privileges and immunities or immunities of citizens of the United States. And I'm going to argue in this next paper that he did so because he realized that his use of Article 4 wasn't getting him where he wanted to go. But that's just kind of a highlight of things that obviously I have to support and that I have to develop. That's in support of your comment that I need to have a far more detailed and respectful look at John Bingham than what I've given in this particular paper, and that's why I'm devoting that for the second part, because I think you're absolutely right. He's a very complicated man who I think has been mistreated in a lot of scholarship.
And crisp with the answers. Thomas Lee, who, like Hugo Black, has been fingering his pocket copy of the Constitution. The floor is yours.
Now, I'm going to be pointed as I can. Page 43 to 46, you talk about the use of the languages of privileges and immunities in the treaties of session and the enforcing acts.
Okay.
And you actually get a lot of mileage out of this because that's the sense that this is something that's clearly defined by federal law. But, I mean, the actual, in 4 of the treaties, the language actually is rights, advantages, and immunities. And in the one that actually uses the word of privileges, that's the Florida Treaty. It says all privileges, rights, and immunities of U.S. citizens. And I wonder how much mileage you can get out of that, because obviously whether it's the Alaska Treaty or the Texas Treaty or the Florida Treaty, when you use that formula, rights, advantages, and immunities, you're thinking vis-a-vis a foreign country that used to have sovereignty over this piece of territory, right? So obviously there's both an affirmative and a negative sense. You can say that affirmatively you're saying that these people have rights, advantages, and immunities of United States citizens in a citizenship sense, but you're also sending a message to the country that used to have sovereignty, that these people are now our people, and we're going to give them some advantage. So I think that there is, you've got, and since you focus so much on terms of art, certainly it makes a difference that those formulations include the word rights and they also use the advantages, and privileges only appears in one of the four treaties that you look at, right? So if you focus on, I mean, I think it's an interesting piece of evidence, but if you focus so much on terms of art, certainly, because these things are very carefully drafted and negotiated, because you're actually dealing with another sovereign who used to have sovereignty over that real estate.
Right. And that's a good point. And I believe that John also kind of raised a similar point in his comments. The idea that how can you call this a term of art when Section 1 uses one particular phrase, privileges or immunities, whereas I'm trying to link it to the Session Act. The Session Act, and then the subsequent acts of Florida and Guadalupe Hidalgo, the negotiations for that, which used different language, right? Which used rights, advantages, and immunities. Well, a couple of points. First of all, I believe that the Session Act of 1803 became boilerplate, right? Wasn't specifically followed in Guadalupe Hidalgo, but you do find it in other places like. And perhaps I think privileges in terms of the Alaskan Treaty. Right. Rights, advantages, and immunities. Exactly right. That's the language. Right. That's the language of the Session Act. Rights, advantages, and immunities. That became boilerplate. And so that language, which doesn't include the word privileges, you're right, that language becomes boilerplate, and that's what you find later on in terms of Florida and later on in terms of Alaska. And I then point out, but the way it is used in terms of political and legal rhetoric doesn't limit itself to that particular sequence of words or even those particular words. What is always the same in people's discussion of the treaties is of citizens of the United States. And sometimes they'll use rights, sometimes they'll use privileges, sometimes immunities, advantages. And so that was part of the first part of my paper, which talked about how those words could be interchangeable. And I believe that was true all the way through into 1868. What rendered them terms of art was not which one of those particular words was used, but their reference to a bundle of privileges or rights or whatever word you would use of citizens of the United States. Right, so that's why I think there's a lot of mixing and matching going on.
After hearing you discuss the second paper, which I really want to read, it's not clear to me how you can get anything more than the thinnest possible version of a term of art. That is to say, everything that you write in this paper suggests that privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States means those rights which one gets by virtue of being a citizen of the United States from the United States. That is, they're the rights that you would be entitled to if you live in federal territories. Right? Sounds good to me. Probably sounded good to almost everybody in the 39th Congress. But the moderates and the radicals disagree. If the moderates and the radicals disagree on what's in those rights, then we don't have a term of art that's more narrowly limited. For purposes of how we interpret the privileges or immunities today, we don't have a more circumscribed meaning of that thing, so everything's in what Larry calls the construction zone. Right. So that's why I wanted to know what the uptake was. Yeah. And I also agree with Jim Fleming's view about slaughterhouse. By the way, it's not slaughterhouse that's the problem, it's slaughterhouse plus Cruikshank.
Cruikshank.
Because once,
Cruikshank's the problem.
The justices who write slaughterhouse are also the justices who write Cruikshank. So you can infer what's going on by reading those two together.
And I don't agree with that. I mean, I know it's true. Cruikshank is clearly the problem.
Who descended in Cruikshank?
You do have a lineup of justices which suggests that Miller had no intention of incorporating the Bill of Rights in Slaughterhouse. But just taking Slaughterhouse on its terms, right? I think that an argument can be made that he left the door open due to his reference to rights which were actually listed in the First Amendment. He gave a narrow definition of them. That's right, the right to petition against the federal,
which is, by the way,
against the federal government.
Reading in Cruikshank. But the more important issue is the first one.
Right. And so. So in terms of what kind of thin gruel are we going to get out of this once we actually get into the distinctions that you get in the 39th Congress, here's what I'm after. Here's one of the key distinctions that I think it is worth developing, even if it doesn't take us all that far down the road in terms of a current jurisprudence. Bingham, again, who's gotten a lot of flack for his mixed-up theories of constitutionalism, I think one of the things that was driving Bingham was his vision as a moderate, that at the end of the day, certain matters would be the subject of federal enforcement, and other matters would be left up to the states, subject to a degree of due process and equal protection. So he became, or at least as he developed his theory in the 39th Congress, he became a textualist And once you get to his 1871 speech, he talks about privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States as defined, as enumerated, as expressly placed within. He uses these very textualist terms that these are the rights that we are granting the federal government power to enforce within the states. And he was very concerned about distinguishing that, even though that leaves open a wide area of construction. At the very least, it distinguished that from federal power to enforce civil rights generally within the states. So that's the fulcrum that really all of this historical analysis is pushing towards, recognizing a lot of things are going to be unsaid, but I think that's important enough. That distinction is important enough to actually develop this, if this really was John Bingham's understanding and if it was everyone else's understanding. And one of the additional pieces of proof that I think would point in that direction is that Bingham was insistent, Bingham and the moderates were insistent on removing the term civil rights from the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He thought it hinted towards too much federal power to actually create the substantive rules of civil rights within the states. So I agree it's going to leave a lot unsaid, a lot left up to construction, but it would be a very specific divide, for example, that would place a very big distinction between Randy Barnett's interpretation of privileges or immunities, for example, and my own.
Mike and Mike, we're at the hour. Do you want to go 5 minutes more? What's your pleasure?
I was going to say maybe one more question.
Larry Alexander.
Well, my question has now been asked 3 times.
Brian would be next on the queue if.
The pairing of Miller and Bingham, you know, and the reading of the slaughterhouse cases. That horse has been flogged a lot. You know.
We have time for Brian then?
Okay. Wait. Steve.
Well, I just wondered at some point whether we should.
Just see if John has one more comment.
John.
Is John here?
Are you still there?
Yeah.
You're live.
We can just raise his hand.
John, we wanted to make sure that you had one last chance to comment or question.
Thank you, because I do in fact want to raise my virtual hand. And there are 2 things I want to say, but I'll just say one of them, and I'll ask you this question, picking up on what Tom Lee said. Wouldn't the other countries involved in those treaties want their citizens who were passing into United States sovereignty to, especially when, as they became incorporated into the Union, to get the rights of both state and national citizenship when appropriate? They would want them to be able to make contracts, something that would come with state citizenship rather than national citizenship, unless the most extreme view of what's included in national citizenship. And does that suggest that a turn of phrase that is similar to what appears in the Privileges or Immunities Clause, which refers to people and not citizenship, refers to the rights of both of the two citizenships?
I think that's quite right. I think the understanding would have been that among the rights, because remember, they were offered or guaranteed the eventual admission, right? That particular word, the eventual admission into the rights.
Treaty in particular seems to look towards statehood.
That's right. And so I think your point is well taken, and maybe this is something that I can further develop, because I think it dovetails quite nicely with the Federalist constitutional principles of John Bingham. The idea that among the rights, privileges, and immunities of citizens of the United States included the 10th Amendment, the idea that you're going to have divided government and that you're going to have civil rights guaranteed under a Republican form of government within individual states. And I'll have to read that once we get there. So I agree with that particular point that they would have been guaranteed a set of rights that would have included a dual idea of citizenship. I think that's quite right.
I'll ask those still in the queue, Brian and Mike Rappaport and Randy to carry on the conversation after the session. And I'd like us all to thank Kurt for a stimulating paper and John for thoughtful comments.
Thank you very much.